This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, as you can see, we have two speakers in the first of the economic relations session this afternoon. The first is on trade. We have papers by Thales Pereira and Robert Greenhill. It's very good to welcome Thales back to London. He's based at the USP, where he's undertaking research on slavery and trade and the role of the Northeast in the international economy in the first part of the 19th century. And he's been supervised by Renato Colistete. Now, I'm sure that many of us in the Brazil community, so to speak, in London know Renato and his work very well. This afternoon, he's going to talk about Brazilian cotton and British trade during the early 19th century. The second speaker is Dr. Robert Greenhill. Bob has made various contributions to business history, and not only the business history of Latin America. His initial research was about the development of steam shipping and shipping conferences, and subsequently he published on the organization on the growth of commodity trades, particularly Latin American commodity trades. He's also produced a very well-received monograph on Johnson's, and I think that people have alluded to it this morning. Johnson's, of course, in their day were one of the biggest coffee export houses. And he's going to present a paper, and his will be the second, on Britain and the Brazilian coffee trade, 1850-1950. But first of all, Thales, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. And since we are recording this presentation, I'm going to read part of my presentation to be more objective. And also currently, I'm now at the University of California at UCLA. I'm a visiting graduate student there. And so my advisors are Renato Colistete and now William Summerhill also. So I'm going to present to you basically an overview of two chapters of my PhD dissertation. And since this conference is about Brazil and Britain relations, this topic here of my presentation is about probably the most important trade relation between these countries during the early 19th century. And it's a surprisingly neglected topic in literature, and that is cotton, raw cotton. So during the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when cotton began to surpass woolens as the main material used in textiles, Brazil was one of the main suppliers of cotton to British manufacturers. Such position as a key supplier was established already at the end of the 18th century. So since I'm going to talk about the early 19th century, you have to forgive me that I'm going to go a little bit earlier than the proposed date for the beginning of the conference. I have to talk a little bit about the end of the 18th century. So after the arrival of the Portuguese royal family in 1808, and the enactment that opened Brazilian trade to foreign vessels, historiography usually focus on the avalanche of imports from Britain into Brazil. However, this narrative may imply that Brazil had nothing to trade in return. And that's a complete false assumption. So the northern states of Pernambuco and Maranhão were the main cotton exporters in Brazil. And throughout the first decade after the opening of the ports, they had persistent trade surpluses with England. Also, trade with England represented around half of all exports from Pernambuco and Maranhão, a much larger share than to Portugal, the second destination for exports. So, during the early 19th century, you have basically four important ports in Brazil. You had Rio de Janeiro, Bahia, Pernambuco, and Maranhão. Those were the most important ports. Those were the ports that Britain sent consuls to. Those were the ports that the United States sent consuls to. There were no other consuls at the beginning of the 19th century beside those four places. So that was the actual action was happening. So therefore, the first objective of this presentation is to present new evidence that supports the statement that Brazil was an important cotton supplier to England. The second objective is to briefly discuss what happened after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when productivity stagnated and Brazil lost part of its importance in the international markets. Data for the first 3 decades of the 19th century are crucial to understand these changes. However, most of the historiography about cotton production in Brazil focus only in the second half of the 19th century, when Brazil was not competitive anymore. So you have these important works by Stanley Stein, Canabrava about cotton production in Brazil, but both of them are only after 1860. And after 1860, Brazil was not even competitive in international markets. But at the beginning of the 19th century, Brazil was very competitive, as I will show you in a little while. So, also, despite recognizing a temporary growth in cotton exports during the last decade of the 18th century, historiography attributes this to a halt in production from the West Indies due to the revolutions in the 1790s and to the U.S. War of Independence. So, for example, Caio Prado, Simonsen, Leslie Beto comments on this also, Boxer, Cabral de Neto, all of these people here wrote something about one of these, that there was an importance in cotton at the 18th century. I'm not telling that people didn't know about that. I will only show you like a different narrative and new data about that. So the problem with the argument of the West Indies and the U.S. War of Independence is that first, during the U.S. War of Independence, the U.S. did not export cotton to Britain yet. So today we have very strong evidence on that, and the reports that show at the ledgers of imports and exports in Britain from the U.S. that showed cotton actually were from the West Indies. So the United States did not export cotton to Britain before 79, only after 79. And about the West Indies, I will show you what's the problem in some slides ahead. So, first importance of Brazilian cotton. So, the rise of cotton exports in northeast Brazil is related to the substitution of woolen textiles for cotton textiles in the last decades of the 18th century. In the initial phase of the Industrial Revolution, Brazil had a share similar to the West Indies, while the US had a very small trade share. So the West Indies were traditionally the main supplier of raw cotton to Britain throughout the 18th century. And at the end of the 18th century, Brazil had the same share as all of the British West Indies. And the United States represented only 10% of cotton trade in Britain. And production in Brazil at this period were basically in Maranhão and Pernambuco, but the most important region was Maranhão, because Pernambuco actually exported raw cotton from other regions inside Brazil. So that also took a while to notice that most of the cotton in Pernambuco was actually from Paraíba and Ceará. They were rerouting the trade. So Maranhão was the most important cotton producer, for sure. So about the sources, so these two chapters that I'm giving you a brief about are basically, you have the British National Archives sources. So a lot of trade data here that I have to compile to build a series that I'm going to show you. And also something that people in the UK use a lot, but people in Brazil usually don't use a lot, that are the British Consul reports. And the British Consul reports, they show a lot of ship records data. So we can track, for example, which kind of product had on each ship and what were the routes. So for example, one of the most common routes was Liverpool, Maranhão, Liverpool, full of cotton. That was like a direct trade. There was no like secondary routes to Maranhão. And other sources, here, the usual sources for the 18th century colonial period Brazil, that's Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, I also collect data from archives in Maranhão, micro data from the plantations of cotton. And also I'm trying to compare Brazil with the United States, so I also went to the US National Archives to gather data there. So I try to combine all of these three sources to make a coherent series, okay? So this table shows British foreign sources of raw cotton, and all of these countries re-exported from their colonies, okay? So for example, you have Holland, France, and Spain were clearly from the West Indies. Turkey was Smyrna cotton, that was very important in the 18th century. Italy exported cotton from Levant, that was present-day Syria, okay? And Portugal, Brazil. So I'm not going to enter into details about that, but in one of my chapters I show why we can be sure that Portugal re-exported only cotton from Brazil. So I went into trade record data, and I look at all the trades that entered the port of Lisbon, and only Brazil had cotton in it. So the other sources didn't export cotton to Portugal. So, and we can see also that Brazilian cotton re-exported from Portugal had a continuous presence in British manufacture. Also, Italy and Turkey were especially important until 1780s because they increased adoption of machinery in the textile sector. So the argument here is that after 1780s, you had the growth in the Industrial Revolution. You began to use machinery to produce cotton textiles. And the kind of cotton that Turkey and Italy exported, they could not fit onto the machines. So there's a lot of evidence on that also. So that's why you see like a sudden drop after the 1780s on these kinds of staples. Yeah, so Smyrna and Levant, you had very short staples using low quality textiles. Okay. So the declining market share after 1780s is highly correlated with the kind of staple each country exported. By 1780s, the average textile count was higher than Smyrna and Levant could produce, that is, Italy and Turkey. Most of the cotton imported was to produce muslins or calicos. Therefore, Brazil was in a very different market, a new market, dedicated to better quality textiles, which resulted in higher profits. So these textiles that were being produced by machines during the Industrial Revolution, they demanded a different kind of staple. That's why you had a shift in the market, and Brazil took advantage of that. Okay, so as you can see here, the average count for textiles in 1780s was 27. It was higher than Turkey could offer. So you could not produce muslins with Smyrna cotton, and much of the British islands also could not provide that kind of staple. So why Brazil? Brazil could provide better quality staples which were used in the emerging textile sectors, the new sectors. This is the demand explanation, okay? So there's a supply side story here that I will not discuss because it's a long story, but one question that may arise is that, okay, but you had a demand, and how could Brazil respond in such short notice? So we had like a supply side story here that I'm not going to enter into, but there is the story, okay? So also, what is the limitation about the other demand side explanation involving the West Indies? Such arguments don't take into account that Britain acquired some important new sources of raw cotton during the revolutions in the Caribbean. So usually the argument about the West Indies is like that. You had the revolution, so because of conflict, supply decreased, and Britain began to search in other markets, and Brazil could provide that cotton. That's the usual explanation, okay? The thing is that during the revolutions, Britain acquired several new key territories that produced cotton. And the most important of them, for sure, was Demerara. And Demerara produced almost 80% of cotton from this new territory. So the thing that I'm going to want to show is this graph, so it's easier to show in a graph. So the black line there is the usual story. If you take only the traditional British West Indies, you see that production of cotton began to decrease after the revolutions. But if you take into account the new territories, you see that there is no decline in production. So the argument that I make is the argument about quality of cotton and machinery. So you have a pretty strong evidence that the West Indies was not so important to that. And also the Merara and Suriname, they produced the same kind of cotton that Brazil did. That's why they were so interested. Okay. So also for the years before the arrival of the royal family, Brazil already represented a larger share in Portuguese trade with Britain. Among all the products exported, the most important by far was cotton. So my argument here is that after the arrival of the royal family, you had also all this important trade with Britain. But these trade routes, all commerce were already established before the arrival of the royal family. It was there already. So we can track this using the information from the Portuguese trade balanças comerciais. And as you can see here, for example, all the products of Portugal, the products of Brazil, total exported to the UK, and the percentage of that total that was cotton. So we can see that in the years before of the royal family arrived, we had on average 75% of all products from Portugal exported to Britain, it was cotton. So it was a huge market between this, huge trade between these two countries. And also the opening of the ports only accelerated the previous trade relation that was intermediated by Portugal, as I already told you. So the graph here shows that exports grew until around 1820. So you had a first increase there in the 70s, 80s because of the quality arguments. And after that trade was made possible directly through Britain, you didn't need Portugal anymore. You see that cotton exported grew very fast until the 1820s. And we can see also this same trend for other sorts, that cotton exports only for Maranhão, they show the same trend. So you begin in the 70s, 80s to grow, and after 1880 you begin to grow faster, and after 1820 you just go completely flat. Okay. So the question that arises is that why this happened? You had an initial advantage. You arrived in the British markets before the United States. You were competitive, and after that you just stopped growing. So the reasons, the literature usually points to these 5 factors there. The problem is that there is very little quantitative evidence to analyze any of these points. Even the argument about declining prices usually only give very broad assertions about trends, but do not present a continued series for prices. So you have all of these, but the problem that we have before 1820 is usually the same, that we don't have data for that. So in my dissertation, I'm trying to collect data to try to at least test in a quantitative way each one of these 5 arguments here. So today I'm going to show you some new evidence about 2 of them. The prices, trending prices, and slave population, labor markets. Okay? So now we have a price series for cotton. Here I show you 5 different sources, but I have for other 6 sources, so we have 11 different sources of cotton prices for almost 100 years, because I just cut it there because it's interesting for this part here. So we have different grades from the US, you have Georgia and New Orleans. You have an average of the West Indies, here the islands that were cheaper than the continent. And you have Pernambuco and Maranhão. So this graph shows that there was a structural break in the price series after 1819. This was a result from the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which reduced dispersion between the series, and also the increase in supply from the US South. It can also be noted that Pernambuco cotton prices were higher on average for most of the period, something that denotes its higher perceived quality. There's a lot of qualitative evidence on that also, people describing the quality of different staples of cotton, and Pernambuco was always one of the most highly regarded. The problem with the argument that a fall in prices was the reason for the Brazilian decline is that this trend was common to all growing regions in the world. Since prices were highly co-integrated, we need to look at other factors, especially difference in productivity. So as you can see here, after the 1820s, variations prices, they became much more co-integrated, and they always move together. So all of these are prices, of course, in pounds at Liverpool, okay? So you take into account all transport costs, all of that. So one logic step is to see productivity difference. And then we have another problem, because you usually don't have population data. So one of the key problems about labor productivity analysis during the 19th century is lack of detailed data. Luckily for Maranhão, there are 3 population maps available for 3 important periods in cotton production. So the gray dots in the figures, I don't know if you can see it, but let me show. You have one here, one here, one here, and this one is the 1872 census, okay? The gray dots in the figure are the population maps for 1800s, 1820, 1840s, and the last one, 1872 census. I use all the available population estimates for this period to check for the consistency in these maps. So if we look only at the maps, it's impossible to know if they are outliers or if they are the real maps based on a trend. So that's why I have to compare to all the other estimates to see if they are consistent across time. As you can see, they are not outliers. There are some interesting possibilities on how to use the information available in these maps. And I'll show you 2 of them. Also, another important thing is that I did this to 5 other provinces in Brazil. And also for Pernambuco. And for Pernambuco, one thing that stands out is that there are 2 huge outliers in the populational estimates for Pernambuco. And they are both Robert Conrad's data. So the data that he uses is the slave population is much higher than it was supposed to be. So that's an interesting finding also. So 2 ways to broadly analyze here productivity difference. So here we have 5 regions in the US, the Cotton South, of course. So you have South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And at the bottom, we have Maranhão, Pernambuco. And the first 4 columns are total production of cotton. And the last 2 columns are a relation between total cotton production and the total number of slaves in each of these areas. So one thing that we can note is that production clearly diverged after 1820s. As you can see, for the beginning of the 19th century, there is no evidence of productivity difference with this aggregate calculation. So there is one obvious problem here, is that you cannot compare productivities based on that, only on that. Why? Because we have to know the number of slaves that work on cotton plantations and not the total number of slaves. So that's pretty obvious. But the thing that I want to show you here is that for the total production until 1820s, Maranhão, for example, did not produce less cotton than some very important states in the US South. for example, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And also this relation between number of slaves and cotton production was not so different at the beginning of the 19th century, when Brazil was very competitive in international markets. So how can we properly account for productivity difference? We need microdata from slave plantations. And that's why that's the thing that I'm gathering now for Maranhão. So hopefully in 6 months I'll have some new, better calculations on that. Just to give you a general figure here. That also the share of slaves in the total population in Maranhão, for example, was not different than any of the U.S. South. So there was, on average, 50% of the population across the period was slaves in Maranhão. And there was a similar relationship in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, while other places like Pernambuco only had 30%. So Maranhão had much higher relative shares of slaves than the other states in the Northeast. It was similar to Rio de Janeiro, for example, that was 50 also. Another way to account for productivity difference is, so this graph shows the relation between prices and the cost of production. So the black line is the price of cotton in pences at the port of Maranhão. So you are accounting here for all the internal transport costs and all of that. And the gray line is the price of Maranhão cotton in Liverpool. So the difference you have, transport costs and all of that. And the dashed line is an estimated cost based on some documents from the beginning of the 19th century that they describe each cost, how much slaves cost in production, how much was transport costs to the port, all of that. So this is are adjusted for difference in exchange rates to account for that. And also now I'm calculating difference in slave prices. So this graph is going to change a little bit also. But the one thing that I want to show you here is just that there is an argument in the literature about cotton production in Brazil, is that cotton prices fell so much that they were below production costs. And there is not so much evidence on that based on these calculations. So prices were usually higher than production costs. And after 1830s, there is also a very important decrease in dispersion between prices of St. Louis and Liverpool. And that's also consistent with new literature that shows that after 1830s, you have several improvements in ship transports across the Atlantic that reduce transport costs. Okay. So there are two estimates here. Okay, so my final remarks is that, as I told you, I didn't enter in any specific details about this, so if you have any questions we can talk about later. It's just to give you an overview about what's my research about cotton in Brazil with the UK. And we can see that Brazilian cotton became important to English factories not only because of geopolitical advantage, as argued before, but also because of its quality. Also, there is very, very strong evidence that trade with England was beneficial for Maranhão and Pernambuco. It was not only a one-sided view that, like, England was exploring the poor Brazil and didn't have anything to give in return. They were growing very fast at that time, and they stopped growing after they lose this place on the international markets of cotton. And also, surprisingly, productivity levels around 1800s were much higher than previously assumed. So the other calculations that I have shows that productivity levels were pretty similar to some places in the US, and that divergence only happened after 1820s. Okay? So I tried to cut 10 minutes. So
Thank you very much.